Hi, everybody. I have never done a virtual class before. I have never done a 3-hour class before. I want to be clear at the beginning, I have no idea what I'm doing, but this should be fun for all of us. I have been a scribe in the SCA since I produced my first scroll in April of 2000. And I've been scribing off and on ever since. I'm not a Laurel. There are things that I don't know. There are things that I'm not an expert on. If you know a better way to do something that I'm teaching, by all means, go ahead and work with that. And we're going to get started. So layout. When you lay out a scroll, there are different kingdoms that have different rules. There are kingdoms that say, so I want to disclaim that this is a Middle Kingdom scroll layout. There are kingdoms say that if you're getting a scroll, has to be such and such a size, which I think is weird, but interkingdom anthropology is like that. The first thing you need are what are called framing margins. Let's push my lap. Framing margins are what you put around it so that somebody wants to put it in a frame, they have a mat, it goes around and it doesn't crowd the picture too much. And those are typically a 1-inch margin all the way around. If you have a triangle and T-square, life is much, much easier when you do this. I do not any longer have a triangle and T-square. Oh, another useful thing about this class is that I am operating on a minimal kit. Fun story, I went through a house fire in January and my big kit, my massive years accumulated worth of stuff, is no longer with me. I've been replenishing in that kit little by little. Replenishing that kit. I almost said the wrong thing. What I'm doing right now is marking 1 inch from the edge on each edge of the paper. I'm using a cheapy metal ruler. If you like, you can use a triangle and T-square. Those are wonderful things to have. If you are in the market for a ruler, try to find a metal one that has cork on the back. You'll note this one does not. I got it during quarantine at the supermarket. It was $1.50, something like that. You can get nicer rulers, but this one will do the job. And I want this class to be accessible for people. I don't want to be pulling out materials that are hard to find or that cost $150 and going, oh yeah, this is the way to do a scroll. That would not be fun for people, I suspect. So once you have your 1 inch on each corner, you just connect the dots. It's really that simple. I'm using a number 2 pencil. Ordinarily, I would not. I prefer to use a harder lead, which makes a softer line. But A, this way you get to see what I'm doing on the page, on the camera. And B, again, I'm not using super fancy materials to make this scroll. I'm using what I have. When I first started out, the paints that I used were acrylics from a paint by number set. And every time I told somebody that, especially the Laurels, they would cringe. It was kind of awesome. And now I use the fancy gouaches and the nice watercolors and the period pigments when I can and stuff like that. You start with what you have and you work with what you know and you build your way up from there. What I'm doing right now, my ruler is only 12 inches long, 12.5 inches long, and my paper is 14 inches long. So I can't connect the dots from edge to edge here. I have to mark them on the lines that I just made. And go like that. The next part we're going to do, I call period margins. I had somebody ask me the other day if in my class I would be talking about the golden ratio. Does anybody here know about golden rectangles or golden architecture, stuff like that? It's a series of proportions that is visually pleasing and is also a proportion that is found in nature a lot. You can look up the golden mean, the golden ratio. the golden rectangle on your own time if you'd like. I chose not to go into golden rectangles here. You can find a golden rectangle on your page and it looks really, really nice, but it's kind of complicated. It is much easier to remember the numbers 1, 2, 3, 4, or if you prefer, 1.5, 2, 3, 4. What I'm referring to are units from the edge of your page. This is now the edge of your page. I'm going to mark 1.5 inches in. I'm going to use the inches and not the centimeters today. 1.5. On the other side, you would want double that, which would be 3. Since we don't have a ton of room here, I'm going to go with 2.5 instead. What this gives you is a narrow margin and a wide margin. And then at the top and bottom, you're going to do the exact same thing, 2 and 4. And what it gives you is a rectangle that is offset a bit from the right side and the bottom of the page. And you can do it the other way so that it's offset from the left and bottom of the page. I suspect this was done for 2 reasons. 1, the rectangle looked pretty. 2, it gave you extra space for border, and it also gave you extra space on the page for your grubby little fingers to turn the page without getting into the text. So I'm going to mark. I marked my top edge and I didn't mark my bottom edge. This is what happens when I get ahead of myself. So again, 1.5 over here, and then here, 2.5. Rather than marking the line all the way up, this is a cheap ruler. I had one that was 14 inches long and it was very helpful. I'm going to mark down 2, and I'm going to mark up 4, and that'll be my first line. Again, I did this 3 times yesterday or the day before, putting together prep materials. I don't know why I'm getting scatterbrained now, except that I'm nervous. 4, 2, connect the dots. And this will be the window for your text block. Does anybody here know how, or not know how, I should say, not know how to use an Ames lettering guide? Or have you ever wanted it to be demonstrated? That's what I plan on doing next.
Hello, can you hear me?
I can hear you, yes.
Oh, this is my first time doing this. I have never used or even seen one in use, but also I'm questioning how dark your pencil is. I would barely use that much pencil. Or is that going to be taken out later?
Yeah, a lot of it will be either erased or painted over so that you can't see it. And I think I mentioned at the beginning of the class, I'm using an ordinary #2 clicker pencil because it's very visible on camera for this. If I were making a real scroll and if I had with me a pencil with a harder lead, I would use that. But a lot of people don't have those pencils and they use these and they work just fine. I am going quite a bit darker than I ordinarily would, but that's mainly for visibility here on camera. So this is an Ames lettering guide. Put it on my hand. No, that doesn't, it's clear plastic, so it doesn't show up very well. Ames lettering guides are kind of awesome. If you know how to use one, you can get parallel lines all the way up your page without having to measure 1/8 inch or 1/16 inches or 1/4 inches or whatever that takes forever to do all the way up. It's really hard to see on here, so I'm going to do my best. Get some glare here. I hope people can see this okay. I had it shining in the window just a minute ago. Anyway.
Try it over the table. See how it looks over the table. Much better.
Is that a little bit better? Yeah, okay.
We can see it fine.
Okay, good, good. You've got 3 rows of dots here, and these are little holes that measure up the middle of this wheel. The wheel itself is adjustable. which is a handy thing. And along the bottom here, you've got numbers 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2. There isn't a 1. And the very bottom of this middle row is where the 10 is. That's the middle row is what you're going to be using. If you line that up with the marker on the bottom here, it's very faint. It's very hard to see. But there's a marker on this bottom body of the plastic as well. And if you line those two markers up, your holes are perpendicular to the bottom of the lettering guide. And that is as wide as you can get it. That's your widest setting. And that makes really big lines. I'll show you out here. You put your pencil in that middle dot just over the number 10, and you go back and forth, and you go in the next hole, and the next hole. And you see how it makes these lines on the page. This is a very, 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 very handy thing when you want to make a scroll quickly. You whip out your lettering guide, and you can space your lines, and it looks really nice. Now, my nib is smaller than this. So I'm actually going to adjust this. I'm just going to turn the wheel. See how I'm turning it until I get to the number 7. I'm still going to use this same row of dots, but now if you look, they're not perpendicular, so they're sort of squished together. And that's what we want. That gives us a narrower set of lines, as I'll demonstrate. You start with the 1 over the 10, 9, well, not 9, but you just work your way up. Now, if you look, you see, can you visibly see the difference in how much narrower these lines are compared to these down here?
Yeah.
That is a really, really useful thing. It lets you use different size nibs. It lets you space your lettering in ways that are period. It just generally gives a much more even and uniform look to your scroll, and it's a lovely, lovely thing to have. It looks like there are 24 people in here, and people are text chatting right now. Thank you for joining if you weren't here at the beginning. If you take the window that says Matilda's, and it shows my hand wiggling in the middle of it right now, and up in the right-hand corner will be a little set of buttons, and it'll say pin video. Pin it, and that'll put it in the big window, and you'll be able to see what you're doing. Unfortunately, this camera doesn't have a mic associated with it, so you might only be hearing the mic associated with the Heather window, which is where I'm talking. And that's my laptop camera. So we're lining out the scroll. A question that you want to ask yourself before you start. You want to ask yourself how large your letters are going to be. And the way that you do that, you take your pen and you take your line and you just make little rows here. Come on, 1, 2, 3, 4. And that is your ideal letter height for what are called minimum height or X height letters. The word minimum has no ascenders and no descenders. Everything is the same height. That is the minimum height. Ascenders are things like the letter B. Come on. I'm going to talk to my materials. I talk to them all the time. I will talk to them in front of an audience now. That is an ascender letter. An ascender ascends, it goes up. I'm writing upside down. I'll get to that in a minute. A descender would be like the letter P. That goes down. This is my stupid party trick, and I will get to that in a minute. But right now, I just want to say, you're looking at this. You look at how wide your letter is going to be, and that tells you how wide you want to set your lettering guide. This is about 3.5 height, nib widths high on line set, what was I? On 7. So I'm going to widen it out to 8. Just widen my lettering guide out. The 8 is over the little mark here. Right, it shows better on the table. That mark is still very faint. Sorry about that. Clear plastic doesn't show up on camera very well, I'm afraid. But once you've answered that question, you know how wide to set your lettering guide. You line up that bottom hole of this middle row of holes here with your text block window carefully. You mutter curse words at your cheap ruler a couple times, and you go across very slowly to make sure that it's lined up, that it doesn't skew up or down from that line. And if it matches, then you proceed and you just fill this in. This will take a few minutes. This is a wonderful, wonderful tool to use on Bristol board, which is what I have right now. It's a great tool to use on Perg. In my experience, if you start working with real parchment or vellum, it tends not to lay very flat. It tends to cockle, and your lettering guide goes up and down, and if it goes down, it slides right off the ruler. It can be a pain on vellum. It can still be done, but you have to go much more slowly and much more carefully. Now, I don't have anybody muted in here, and I'm also, my glasses are off, so I can't see if you're going to raise your hand with a question or anything like that. I can't see the chat window. I'm sorry about that. But if anybody has any questions right now, this has taken a couple minutes, so now is a good time to ask.
I have a question what you're going to do when you run out of holes and how you can, the same as, didn't quite see how you knew that you were lined up at the bottom.
Okay. You take this bottom hole, this one right here, and you bring your ruler up, and you just line it up with your bottom line. And then you double check. You go across slowly without your pencil. You make sure it's lined up on the other side as well. You test it with your pencil. And if it works, then you keep going. If it doesn't work, you adjust your ruler a little bit so that it's lined up neatly. Is this making sense for people so far?
Yeah. What did you say this guide is called?
It's called an Ames lettering guide, or it's also called an Alvin lettering guide. Shameless commercial plug here. I get almost all of my scribal supplies from a small business in North Carolina. They have like 8 people that work there, called John Neal Booksellers. They are wonderful. They sell these. They run, I think, about $4.
Is that Ames, A-I-M-S?
A-M-E-S, Ames. Because they're made, it turns out, in Ames, Iowa. So if you look for Ames lettering guide, you'll find them. They're usually clear plastic like this. Sometimes they'll be a green plastic.
Thank you.
And then John Neal also is calling it an Alvin lettering guide. I guess that's its actual brand name, but I've never seen it called that before. If you sit down to talk with a bunch of scribes and you talk about the Ames lettering guide, they'll all know what you're talking about.
Can you repeat what you said about the width of the letters? How
Yes, I will demonstrate that momentarily. Let me finish lining this, and then I will demonstrate for you on the lines itself.
Thank you.
Sure. I know my head is probably in the camera right now. Oh, it's not. Hey, look at that. Earlier when I was testing out the technology, my head kept getting right underneath the camera. So you just, again, you take that bottom hole and you line it up with your top line. And if it lines up well, you keep going. And somebody did mention already, and it is a very good point, these are pretty dark lines. Now, if you'll notice, there's an ever so slight discrepancy here and here in the width of that final line. That happens a lot. What's happening is you're making microscopic little errors in the angle of your lines as you go, or this isn't quite right, excuse me, or the edges of the paper weren't exactly parallel or something like that. So you get tiny little errors. So what you do is you just make one extra line and call that the bottom of your rectangle, and you don't worry about it. When you're finished with your painting and everything else, a difference that tiny is not going to be noticeable. It's definitely not going to be noticeable on your wall. Now we're almost finished lining out and doing the layout portion of the scroll. We just have one last step, and I only discovered this for myself recently. I used to have, this was my space for my illumination, and I would run all the way up and bump into the text, and it would look weird. If you look at period manuscripts, and I have a couple samples right here, if you look at this, there is a gap between the text and the illumination. And here's a couple more pages. There's a gap. So we're going to build that gap into our layout real quick. And you use the lettering guide to do this. It's very simple. You take that line, the second bottommost hole, and line it up with your line here. And you come down here. I'm way, way off. Now I'm not. You test it again. You go slow. You always test this. It's very much like carpentry. Measure twice, cut once, as they say. And then you go to the bottom hole, and there's your gap. That's what's going to be between the illumination and the text. And we're going to do that all the way around. Just takes a minute. Any further questions so far, or are we doing good?
I just came in a little bit late, so I missed how you measured your border and your calligraphy box.
All right, I can come back to that.
Okay.
A really, really easy way to remember it is 1, 2, 3, 4. If you want to be picky, it's 1.5, 2, 3, 4. And that's units. It's not inches or centimeters or anything like that. It's whatever unit you want to use. I've done where my unit was 1/2 inches before, so that this was 3/4 of an inch wide over here. And then this was more than that, double that, like 2 1/4 or something like that. What I measured was 1.5 inches here. And then for visual, I didn't want that extra 1/2 inch cutting in. So this is actually 2.5 inches wide here. So 1.5, 2.5, instead of 1.5 and 3. 2, 4. It's 1.5, 2, 3, 4. There is a period technique for determining a golden rectangle, which looks really nice on your page. It is visually very pleasing. It's a little complicated. It's hard to do on a single sheet like this. It works best if you've got 2 pages side by side, because you can build 2 golden rectangles and then you paint them, you write them in and you've got 2 separate pages. This comes close enough. It's a good approximation of the golden rectangle, and it gives you room for, your scroll text, which is always nice to have. Kind of the reason you're doing the scroll in the first place, right? So you test it, measure twice, cut once. One last line here. So now you'll have a text block that isn't going to get run into by your illumination. And if by chance you're writing along and you have a word that goes too long, like you thought you had room for the word heraldry and you only had room for the word heraldry, you can stick that last letter out here and people will forgive you. You've built in a little bit of leeway, a little bit of padding for yourself doing this. So that is the very beginning. These are the steps that almost nobody ever gets to see. I could go into 2-column layouts. I could go into the largest scroll I have ever physically worked on. Looks like 2 pages side by side, and each page has 2 long skinny columns. It was massive. I'm gonna have to start it over, which is a pain in the butt, but it is what it is.